Industry and the market revolution. Okay, so before the market revolution, most Americans made a living by growing or making most of the stuff that they needed to survive. Most families were farmers, or at least owned some farmland, and they grew most of their own food. Daughters and wives would make clothes and shoes and other household stuff, and men would usually build their own houses and make their own tools. This was a culture of self-sufficiency. And there were some advantages to this system. One was that your work, when you worked, was meaningful because you got to keep all the stuff that you made. Also, if you didn't work, you didn't get to have stuff, but you got to choose exactly how much you wanted to work. So maybe you could decide you didn't really want a new pair of shoes, and then you wouldn't have to make them. So you were your own boss back then. But there were some disadvantages to this system as well. One big one was that less stuff gets made overall because few people specialize. Basically, everybody has to do a little bit of everything, and so nobody gets really good at anything. Also, almost everything is made by hand in small batches, and this means that less stuff gets made because it all takes a really long time. This all changes with the market revolution. So the market revolution is a transformation of how stuff gets made and distributed in the United States. And this happens between 1800 and 1900, and it's made possible by two big things: industrial manufacturing and high-tech transportation. With industrial manufacturing, most stuff gets made in factories using machines driven by steam power. This is a much more efficient system that results in lots of more stuff getting made. High-tech transportation involves stuff like railroads, canals, and steamboats, and this makes it way easier to get stuff from the factories to the people that want to buy them. The main effects of the market revolution are that more people move to cities to work in factories. Most people stop making their own stuff and instead work for a paycheck and then use the paycheck to buy stuff that gets made in factories. And also, there's just way more stuff. Stuff is getting made in factories, and there's a lot more of it to go around, so America becomes richer overall. And one thing that you guys should know about the market revolution is that it only happens in the North until the Civil War. So up until the Civil War, the South is not doing any of this. It's only afterwards that the South starts to catch up to the North in terms of industry. It would have been impossible without certain important technologies that were invented around this time period. We're going to go through 6 of these, 3 on this slide and 3 on the next. The first was the factory system. And the factory system was more a breakthrough in how we organized work than in any sort of tool that we built. And so a factory is just a place where you assemble workers in a single place where they can be watched and forced to work a certain number of hours. And what you would do then is you would basically have all the workers specialize in just one small part of the overall process, which would make the jobs easier. So instead of building a whole musket or making an entire shoe, if you worked in a factory, you would just do one small part of that. So maybe if you were making a gun, it would be your job just to make the trigger. And then you would just make a whole bunch of triggers in a single day. And it would be somebody else's job to make a barrel, and another person's job to make the stock, and then another person's job to put it all together. And so this made it way easier to build a single musket. And you didn't have to be super, super good in order to work in a factory, because it's not very hard just to make stuff like a trigger. And so this results in lots more stuff getting made. Another important technology was the steam engine. And the steam engine was a device that would burn coal in order to create steam, and the steam would then be used to power different machines. This allowed for lots of different automated machines that could be used to replace human workers or to multiply the effectiveness of a single worker. And Also, there was the cotton gin, and this was actually one of the few technologies that was widely adopted in the South. And the cotton gin made it possible to quickly remove seeds from cotton, and this made cotton extremely valuable and made it the main crop in southern plantations. Because of this, factories are able to begin producing tons and tons of cotton, cloth, and clothing. There's a picture there of a cotton gin being operated. Technologies that come online during the market revolution include the spinning jenny. And so the spinning jenny was a machine that used steam power or some other source of power, maybe like water power, to spin cotton into thread. And this thread this machine allowed for a huge increase in the amount of thread that a single worker could make, and therefore led to way more cloth getting made. Railroads were really important. They were a machine that used steam power to move cars along an iron track. And this made it much easier to transport stuff, and it also made it way more reliable. If you put something on a train, you could be pretty sure it was going to get to its destination. Railroads are important because it made it easier for factories to ship stuff to the people who wanted to buy it. So you could make something up in Boston, and you could put it on a train and sell it all the way out in Illinois or somewhere along the banks of the Mississippi River. And finally, there was the telegraph. And the telegraph was a machine or a device that would send signals along wires. And these signals could be used to send messages very quickly over long distances. And this is important because it made it easier to buy and sell stuff, because people could place orders whenever they needed to. So factories knew where to ship stuff and how much to make. So there were two new classes of people that came about because of the market revolution: factory owners and factory workers. So the people who benefited the most from the market revolution were wealthy people who could afford to invest in factories and railroads and other modern technologies. And they could make incredible fortunes in this new economy by starting up factories or building railroads or other stuff like that. Workers, on the other hand, stuff was a little bit harder for them. There were some benefits from the time period. For example, there were more job opportunities especially for unskilled workers, and there was also sometimes an increase in income. You could actually make more money working in a factory than you could maybe working on somebody else's farm. But there were a lot of costs to working in a factory. One was harsh working conditions. Factories were usually loud and dark and dangerous. Another was that wages were low and the hours were long. Lots of workers in the beginning of the days of factories would work 13-hour days, and they would make just barely enough to get by. There was also less freedom. People didn't really get vacation time, and you basically had to do whatever your boss told you to do, otherwise you could get fired. And also there was a widespread use of child labor, which lasted for quite a long time and was terrible for many reasons, primarily because it prevented children from getting an education, which kind of doomed them to this sort of dangerous, low-level work for the rest of their life. Because of the market revolution is that the role of women in society changes. Before the market revolution, women played an important role in the household because they made just as much stuff as the men. So the men depended on the women just as much the women depended on the men. After the market revolution, households stopped making stuff, and so women fall into one of two new roles. One is working outside the home in a factory or as a servant. And what this did is it gave more independence to women because they were making their own money and could make their own decisions, and they could even go off and live on their own if they wanted to. Unfortunately, women tended to get paid less than men did, even if they were doing the same kind of job. This, by the way, is still mostly true today. The other thing that women could do if they didn't want to go off and get their own job was to become a, quote, housewife. And basically what this meant is they left the responsibility of making money up to the men who would get a job in a factory or a store or some other place. And then the women would, instead of making money or making stuff, would just stay at home and basically keep up the house and raise the children. And what this meant is that wives became really dependent on their husbands, and they sort of became less powerful because they no longer held such a central economic role in the household. And so the market revolution could be viewed as being good for women in some ways, but in other ways they actually lose power because they stop making so much important stuff. All right, and so here are your goals again. I hope that you found this interesting, and I will talk to you tomorrow.